I would like you all to take a moment and think of some of the qualities a good president should have. Perhaps you think a president should provide strong leadership or set a good example for people to follow. Or perhaps you think a president should be compassionate or maybe even charismatic. However, I'm sure none of you characterized a good president as being vicious, as someone who actively cultivates vices. One of the most significant vices is greed, which is defined by Merriam-Webster as a selfish and excessive desire for more of something than is needed. Another key vice is injustice, which is defined as a violation of right or the rights of others. I'm here to argue that President Andrew Jackson embodies both of these vices in several ways. Though I'm sure we've all learned about Andrew Jackson in our history classes, I have taken this knowledge a few steps further. My extensive research makes me well qualified to make an unbiased judgment on the character of Andrew Jackson. Today, I will be arguing that President Andrew Jackson is not only a bad president, but also a bad person because of the way he exemplifies the vices of greed and injustice through his exploitation of slave labor, abuse of presidential powers, and cruel mistreatment of Native Americans and African Americans. First, let's talk about Andrew Jackson's notorious use of slave labor. In order to satiate his greedy desire for wealth and prestige, Andrew Jackson employed slave labor. Andrew Jackson grew up poor, but began to crave wealth and social status as he got older. According to the White House Historical Association, slavery was the primary source of Jackson's personal wealth. In 1804, Jackson owned 9 slaves and purchased the Hermitage, a 1,000-acre plantation. By the time of his death, Andrew Jackson was said to have accumulated about 161 slaves. Andrew Jackson's greed led to the cultivation of injustice, as he treated slaves in an inhumane manner in order to serve his own self-interests. Jackson used the slaves to gain wealth and prestige, and even took the slaves with him to the White House when he was elected president in 1828. Unfortunately, Jackson's use of slavery for personal gain was not exactly an uncommon practice of the time period. An 1860 census showed that about 32% of Southern white families owned slaves. Additionally, according to Evan Andrews of History.com, at least 12 chief executives, over a quarter of all American presidents, were slave owners during their lifetimes. Of these, 8 held enslaved people while in office. Now, I'm going to tell you how Andrew Jackson continued to exhibit greedy behavior and unjust behavior while serving as the 7th President of the United States. As president, Andrew Jackson made decisions to greedily benefit himself and his supporters rather than the American people as a whole. Andrew Jackson introduced the spoils system, which historical writer Sellers defines as Jackson's policy of removing his political enemies from federal office and replacing them with his friends. This is surely advantageous for Jackson and his supporters, but could be harmful to the American public. Since government jobs are allotted based on political loyalty rather than job qualifications, the American people may not be receiving the best possible version of their government, which could easily be viewed as an injustice or violation of their rights. In addition to creating the spoils system, Andrew Jackson also abused his veto power as president. The Constitution does not explicitly state how the veto power should be used. The earlier presidents only vetoed a bill or a law if they believed it to be unconstitutional. Andrew Jackson, however, used the veto power for political rather than constitutional reasons, most notably by rejecting the bill for the Second Bank of the United States. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of his presidency is when Andrew Jackson completely disregarded the system of checks and balances by refusing to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester v. Georgia. Chief Justice John Marshall shared the court's opinion that the Cherokee Nation is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. In retaliation, Andrew Jackson famously declared, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Jackson outright defied the court's decision by continuing with his plan to remove Native Americans from their homes. Finally, I'm going to elaborate on Andrew Jackson's misuse of presidential power and show how it resulted in specific acts of injustice against minority groups in America. Jackson's refusal to follow the system of checks and balances and the implementation of the spoils system directly led to the opposition of Native and African Americans. Despite the Supreme Court's decision that Georgia has no authority over Native lands, Andrew Jackson still enforced the Indian Removal Act of 1830 to displace Native Americans from their homelands. This resulted in the Trail of Tears, in which about 15,000 Cherokee Indians were forced to leave their homes and relocate westward. The Trail of Tears is undoubtedly one of the greatest atrocities in American history, causing about 4,000 Native Americans to die from starvation, exposure, and illness. Author Amy Sturgis blames the Trail of Tears on Andrew Jackson when she asserts, if the executive had enforced the decision of the judiciary in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, the Trail of Tears might not have happened. In addition to facilitating the blight of thousands of Native Americans, Andrew Jackson also encouraged the oppression of African Americans by his corrupt use of the spoils system. Andrew Jackson nominated Roger Taney, one of his supporters, to become a member of the Supreme Court. Once in the Supreme Court, Taney delivered the infamous Dred Scott decision, which held that no African American had ever been or ever could be a citizen of the United States, and that Congress possessed no authority to limit slavery's expansion into the federal territories. It should be no surprise why Andrew Jackson has earned the title of one of the most controversial figures ever to stride across the American stage by author Charles Greer Sellers Jr. Although he has certainly left his mark on history, Andrew Jackson's legacy is far from completely favorable. Andrew Jackson exemplifies the vices of greed and injustice, mainly because of his use of slave labor, his abuse of presidential power, and his oppression of Native Americans and African Americans. So, if you're ever considering the qualities of a good president, I urge you to think about Andrew Jackson. Recognize how many of Jackson's attributes and actions are diametrically opposed to that of a good president. In this light, it should become clear that Andrew Jackson's vicious behavior makes him not only a bad president, but also a bad person.